begin with some introductions. So hi, my name is Sam Cooke. I'm working with Benita today to help present a just public information session on carbon markets and carbon taxes. And I'm the CEO of an environmental company called CarbonX. And I work quite a lot with a edtech education platform here in Hong Kong called Accelerate. I think no one else is joining right now, so we'll just get started then. A little bit about my background as well. I'm also a scuba diving instructor. I've been working as one for a while. I'm a sailing instructor. I've spent my entire adult life in the environmental field, working in things such as sustainability, ESG, carbon markets, carbon accounting. And I've worked for NGOs such as OceansAsia, multinational development banks such as the Asian Development Bank, founded my own environmental startup and worked as a researcher in this area for CUHK and also for a carbon capture company. And I hold 2 degrees in this, a degree and a master's both in the environmental sector. So everyone can see this. So first things first, what are carbon markets and carbon tax? So the first one is the carbon market, and there's 2 types. We have a compulsory market and a voluntary market. The compulsory market is where you have a government-regulated market system in which companies at the state, county, country, and international level all trade together. And they trade with something called a carbon credit, which is a measure of emissions, and it's usually denoted in CO2 equivalent at the 1-ton level. So this compulsory market, some of the most common ones, the largest ones are the China and the European Union, and then the United Kingdom, and then you also have smaller ones at a state level, such as in California or a few states in the US, such as Maine, New York, Massachusetts, all banding together, as well as other ones in Canada, Korea, etc., Japan as well. The second thing you have is voluntary markets, which works as an offsetting program. So if a company produces a large amount of emissions and they want to improve their ESG and want to improve their sustainability rating, but they can't play within the compulsory market, or the compulsory market is too expensive, they can promote how they're working within the voluntary market by basically donating for different programs around the world, such as tree replanting or energy efficiency in a different nation. The next thing is carbon taxes. Carbon taxes are very simply a tax on the emissions from the production and operations of a business. So this is again a policy instrument in which the government taxes you on how much you produce. So that's the very basics, and I'll go through each one of them in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So yeah, the first one that we're talking about is the carbon tax. This is a preset price per ton of emissions as set out by the government. Usually it's at the 1-ton level. And because it's a set price for the year or the month, it can't tell you how much your emissions will go down, but it is seen as an incentive to not produce as much. And it works off this principle called polluters pay, which is because pollution is a social harm, it causes harm to both society and the environment, you must pay the government for the privilege of producing pollution. And because of that, it's very much seen as a policy tool to disincentivize bad behavior. In this case, bad behavior is pollution. Any questions so far? No? No, okay, great. Next slide. So at the moment, there's 35 carbon taxes around the world, and it can be an extremely large source of revenue for different governments. For example, a US Treasury report in 2017 was examining the effects of what if they implemented a countrywide carbon tax, and they found that if they put in a carbon tax of $49 US, it would have raised 2.2 trillion over 10 years for the United States government. So about 220 billion per year. And you can see this happening in different countries. For example, France, which has takes part in both the European emissions trading scheme, but also has its own carbon tax, has successfully raised 6.8 billion USD by April 2021 from its carbon tax. And that's just from 2017 to 2021. All right, one more person. Okay, so carbon taxes, as mentioned, are all over the world, but I think this image here offers a good comparison of how it can actually work and the price differences you can get even within the same continent. So I don't know if everyone can see the prices for per ton of carbon here, but what we have is we have some very low prices per ton of carbon, such as in Poland, where the price of 1 ton of CO2 as a tax is 7 euro cents, while on the other end of the scale, we have Sweden, where the Swedish government, if you're regulated under this carbon tax, you have to pay 116 euros per ton of CO2 you emit. Earlier, we were talking about the French system and how that's raised a few $1 billion for the government. That's with a carbon tax of 45 euros. So I'll just let you guys have a look at this image for a little bit longer. And please let me know if there are any questions you have about how a carbon tax works and also how it can raise revenue for the government or how it can disincentivize pollution. Any questions so far?
Sam. Oh, sorry. Ada, you first.
Yeah, sorry. So Sam, so has the tax been sort of increased or throughout the years, or which countries would you say is a bit more progressive in pushing sort of bigger penalty per se?
Well, you can see this a little bit on the graph, on the picture here. Can you see the picture? Yeah, so as you can see, some of these countries, the tax is just insignificant, 7 cents per ton for Poland, 25 cents per ton in Ukraine is not going to make a dent. But then, for example, in Sweden, it's 116 euros per ton. That's very high. That's, I believe, the highest in the world. Lithuania, so down here, LI, 85 euros per ton, and then Switzerland as well at 85 as well. So that's where I'm seeing the biggest taxes. Regarding increasing prices, so I don't know the exact details for each one because there are 45 different tax programs around the world currently. But for example, the price set in France was set in 2019, I believe, and it was supposed to increase. Sorry, it was set in 2018 and was supposed to increase in 2020 and also in 2021. But remember how a few years ago, France was having all those riots around fuel charges. And that was actually a very big reason was the carbon tax. The fuel charges were associated with the carbon tax because they had to pay both for the fuel, but also the tax on the emissions associated with that fuel. So when the French government tried to increase the tax, there were huge protests as part of that general movement, and they had to cap it for the last 3 years at this 45 euro rate. So there can be quite a lot of pushback as well, because this is a direct cost to you as a consumer. I think there was one more question, right?
Yeah, so thanks for sharing, Sam, so far. I think, this is very informative. I just wanted to kind of also understand whether because you shared that, across different continents, China, Europe, and then Australia, etc., they're also within like their own different kind of programs. Could you share a little bit more so far from your observations, whether, is there, which is more reactive, which is more, less, why, the challenges? I'm sure it's all political and everything else too, but if you could share a little bit on kind of your observations so far across the continents, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Do you mind if I share that in about 15 minutes? Because I've got a big slide with all the different programs around the world and which ones are doing which. So if
Wonderful.
Yeah, all right, perfect. So I'll hold up on that one for now. I'll go to the next slide then, if I can. There we go. So, so this is one thing called the compulsory market, and this also will explain a little bit more about how reactionary versus proactive it can be. So a compulsory market, it can be a little bit complicated, works from a government regulation standpoint. And this is one of the most common ways to reduce emissions, such as in the European Union. It's a top-down approach where the government sets an absolute limit of emissions that a industry can produce. And this can be either at a country or European Union level or at a state level. From that, you will then reduce how many emissions can be produced per year, and you will allocate a number of free emissions to each company. And then they can buy more credits from the government and then trade amongst themselves as long as the absolute limit is not exceeded. So for example, you can see here, this is a reduction over time. In the EU, for example, this is currently 2.2% absolute reduction in emissions per year. So you can achieve a overall emissions that is quite low by a few years in, and there's the drop. The market itself works in that you have three levels. You've got free credits, which the government just gives to every industry as long as that is producing. Every company within the industry that is producing. You then have auctions, so you can buy and sell from the government. And then after you've bought and sold, you can then trade amongst each other as long as you're taking part within this market. In the European Union, as an example, about, I believe, 40-ish% of all large companies are trading on this market as long as they produce over 20,000 tons of CO2 per year. And the EU system has been going through multiple different phases. So Benita at the start mentioned the SDGs, and carbon markets and carbon taxes do interact quite closely with the SDGs, especially on goals number 7, 8, 11, and 13. So number 7 is affordable and clean energy. So what carbon markets do is they try and pivot people away from using fossil fuels to using renewables, because it acts as almost a tax on the usage of fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are the primary means in which we produce CO2. Decent work and economic growth. It's a pivot again in how investments are spent to try and build new infrastructure, which also will influence the sustainability of the city systems. So in a city such as Hong Kong, for example, I believe over 70% of our emissions are from our buildings, which means from our power consumption. If we move, we can't as Hong Kong, but a move towards more renewables would of course lead to number 11 and number 8. And that would be, and carbon markets could be one way you could do this in certain cities. Yeah, so carbon markets affect number 11, 7, and number 13 down here. These are how the SDGs interact with the economy, society, and the biosphere. So a little bit about the history of the carbon system. It's pretty old. The first ones came into being in the 1990s in Europe, right around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. And this was just carbon tax in 3 separate countries, Finland, Lithuania, and Poland. For the first 10 years of the system, there wasn't very much change. You saw a few other countries getting added in, such as Norway, Sweden, and one of the Baltic states. But that was all you've got over 10 years, just a few countries using a very small tax in order to tax certain producers. The first real change you saw was in 2005, and this also links back into the reactive proactive, since this was the first implementation of a trading scheme. So this was the government actually setting out goals to reduce the emissions in certain industries, and this was the EU putting it in as entire block based. So you can see there how you've got countries with both an ETS and a carbon tax, as well as the entire EU system trading carbon amongst each other within certain industries, but still very European centric at this period of time. Next 5 years, you saw the start of some pilot programs in different countries. So that's a pilot program in the northeast part of the United States. Tokyo put in a pilot program as well, just to trade emissions within the city. New Zealand started a trading program, and then there's a tax and a trading program within some of the provinces in Canada. 2015, still quite minimal, not very many trading systems. You have an extra tax in Ukraine and Mexico, some trading happening in Kazakhstan, as well as pilot programs starting up in China. So these pilot programs was in preparation for a full country trading scheme, which just started in 2021. And it was a trading program in Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Tianjin, Nanjing, Beijing, and Shanghai. And then what we've really seen over the last 6 years since 2015 is an explosion in this whole carbon taxing and ETS system. So you now have a carbon tax throughout all of Canada, multiple different pilot programs, different countries considering using it. You've got the first few systems getting set up in the African continent with South Africa in 2019 through a carbon tax, and also the Chinese ETS system coming online in 2021. So at the year end of 2021, there were a total of 65 different forms of pricing initiatives. Of course, some of them were a lot more proactive and could do a lot more than other ones. Over 45 different countries with a bunch of pilot programs happening around the world. And with this image, I would like to go back to your question earlier about the proactiveness of some of them. So yes, you're very correct. In the European Union, I would say is the most proactive, and it's the one that is trying to reduce emissions the most. So over 2021, you saw a price increase per ton of carbon being traded on the EU market from just over 30 euros at the start of 2021 to over 90 euros at the end. And they were doing this because of a few reasons. First was the European Green New Deal, which was signed as part of their COVID relief package to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to a 2005 base level. Hoarding of credits, energy security risks as well, again, with COVID surges and everything. A speculation by banking systems, and just a whole host of other reasons. So that's the pricing in the EU, for example. That would, I say, is the clearest example of a system that is running rather well. It's got very clear goals. It's got an absolute emissions limit that keeps decreasing over time. And then and it's also a very large revenue maker for the bloc as a whole. You can compare that to a less proactive system, which would be, for example, the Chinese system, especially with the pilot programs, where the vast majority of credits were given out for free. There was no absolute limit on how much you could produce. There was an absolute limit on how much you could produce, but it was actually increasing per year. And it was focused on increasing efficiency, but it didn't really work because also the pricing compared to the EU market, for example, was at about 1/10 of the price per ton. So you can see there how you implement it can have a very, very large effect. Yeah. So can everyone see this graph? This is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. The price movement in the EU per ton of carbon started at just over 30 something euros, peaked at over 90 over here, and fell a little bit with the Ukraine crisis a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, it's a very quick rise as well compared to normal carbon markets, and it's been the largest development lately. And then even though the United Kingdom left this market, it still has seen a similar price increase in its own carbon market that it set up in response to Brexit. So yeah. So these were the reasons that I found for this increase that you could see. Falling limits, more companies trying to reduce emissions through different means, the new EU 2030 climate framework, a G7 pledge to limit global warming, institutional investors turning it into a financial asset, hoarding of credits because you get your credits and you can buy your credits at the start of the year and you don't know what's going to happen with all these market shocks. So you might keep credits and you might up production near the end and release more of them onto the market. And that's part of the reason why you can explain this 3x increase in price over a 1 year period. So some notes on the ETS systems and how it works. Again, with some general exceptions, is really an internal market. You could see that in the previous slides of how there's all these different groups that work independently of each other. It regulates very large companies. In the EU, for example, it's companies that produce over 20,000 tons of CO2 per year. It only covers certain sectors. And the primary idea is it's supposed to make companies more efficient and invest in new technologies, use more renewables, produce less, and also upgrade their equipment so that they can decouple themselves from production and emissions. And it can also be very useful. In the UK and EU, it's one of the primary mechanisms that they're using to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030 when compared to a 2005 base. Any questions at this point? Any additional questions at this point?
Hi, Sam. Thank you for this information.
Mm-hmm.
Just a very quick one. When a company reports their emission, is that just scope 1 and 2, or they also include in the scope 3?
That's a very good question. So at the moment, it's primarily scope 1 and 2. Again, I'm using the EU as a base case because it's the most developed out of all of them. You saw how they've had this system in place since 2005. They're slowly reworking the system, and they've just moved into revision 4 or stage 4, and they're trying to see if they can increase scope 3 emissions. One of the primary ways they're doing this is they're looking at putting a tax on the import of goods, a carbon tax, a climate tax. So once this comes in, then you'll see more and more scope 3 emissions being accounted for on the ETS system.
Could you explain a little bit when you said this import goods, you mean this CBAM, this carbon border
Yes,
adjustment?
the carbon border tax.
Right, okay. And how does that link to the scope 3?
Well, so scope 3 is basically it's your supply chains. So if you are buying products with this and it's not getting produced, but it's being consumed somewhere else, then that's what a scope 3 emission measures, right? So they're trying to see about adding this as an additional tax for companies. How this actually links into the ETS system, I think is still very much in development, since they've only just started phase 4, and the the border tax itself, it hasn't been fully implemented yet. There's still a lag time before it gets implemented. So the intricacies of how this would work together, I'm not sure, because I think that's still very much a work in progress, even at the legislative level.
Right, thank you, thank you.
No worries. Okay. Yeah, so I was talking about the revenue system earlier. For example, when the pricing was still a lot lower from 2012 to 2020, about 57% of the credits were actually auctioned off, and this helped raise 57 billion euros from this time period. In 2019, the revenue was 14 billion alone. And by auctioning credits, and because it's government run and because it's all mandated by the government can decide how it's used. So for example, by law, at least 60%, I believe 50% of the revenue raised had to go into climate and energy sectors. In actuality, from 2013 to 2019, around 78% of revenue was used for climate and energy purchases. And the EU system, as the largest international system, had allowed 28 countries to auction their allowances on the market. Now, again, now that we've explained it a bit more, I wanted to show this graph again. And if you had any other ideas of why you might see this large price change other than what I've said, please feel free to share at this moment as well on why you believe we had such a huge spike over a year. Yeah, okay. I think that means I've covered most of them. So let's go into the voluntary carbon market. So the voluntary carbon market is slightly different. The way it works is as an offset program, allowing almost anyone to participate. So for example, if I wanted to, I could participate in the voluntary carbon market today. And it's used as a way to help companies reduce overall emissions through other practices, so they don't actually need to decrease their production because they can just buy forest replanting or electric stoves in a different country. So you can see how I've said this is too expensive. And there's many, many suppliers around the world, all with different standards and different regulations on how it works. I know the next question will be, how does this relate to the compulsory system? And the answer is very loosely right now. Under the current revision schedule, again, in the European Union, they are seeing if there are ways that we can include voluntary emissions, so reductions into the full system, as well as buying credits from other countries and from their systems, such as creating a linkage service between the EU system and the Chinese system, or the EU system and the American systems. But at the moment, this is still very much a work in progress, and there will be more developments as we go through the new phase, which is supposed to last until, I believe, 2025. So this is quite cool, and something that I recommend everyone just have a look at if they're curious, because there's so many people that offer voluntary carbon emissions and so many different projects. You can actually select what you feel most passionate about. So I've included two databases here. One is called Gold Standard, and one is called Vera. Vera is the largest VCM network on Earth, I believe, and Gold Standard is quite a large one as well. If you look on the left at Gold Standard, you can see how there's a variety of different projects that you can sponsor, all for the reduction of 1 ton as an individual. But because they all take place in different geographic regions and they're all working with different societies and groups, the price can vary quite a lot, from 10 USD per ton, for example, for mini hydro projects, to 45 USD per ton for reforestation in Costa Rica. So that's quite a simplistic way to look at it. It's very easy to understand and to allow the average consumer. Vera, on the other hand, usually deals with larger projects, and it's less pitchery. So you can see how they have the name of the project type, and then also it gives you a little bit more information on the methodology they use up front. Any questions so far?
I have a really silly question, but just coming from a corporate or business's perspective, how even say, for example, a business, they want to do this voluntarily and they come onto this platform and kind of look at, browse through these programs. Two questions. One, how could that business ensure that this was done? Like, that's kind of the, I'd say, on compliance level, right? How could you make sure that these are done? Which sounds a little silly, but businesses do ask. But then second level is like, how do they usually, like platforms like these, do they usually have like kind of a reporting format as well? So to kind of enable the business to claim that they have made this contribution?
Yeah, so they do on both fronts. This is why I've used Gold Standard and Vera, because they're the two of the most common ones. So they have their methodology on their homepage, pretty much saying exactly how they do it, how they comply, how they show their compliance. And then because they're also the largest ones, they have a certificate that can tell you have done this. So the business can report that they have donated and that the project was done. But that's because they're the largest ones. So they are very conscious and aware of this. And I believe these would be the type of companies that would slowly get integrated into compulsory market over the next stage. And then your second question was about, compliance for the companies.
And how could they ensure that these actually happened? As in, sometimes you talk about these programs that happens all over the world. How could the business know that this actually existed or happened?
Mm-hmm. Again, that's same answer. It's just you have to trust that they have thousands of clients, both individuals and corporates. They get audited quite often. They put their methodology for the public to see. So I think there's a level of trust to be had there, but also they do try quite hard to make sure that you can see where the money is going. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries. So these are the two largest ones, but there's many, and some of them can work in different sectors as well. For example, I know none of us are traveling right now, but when I was flying, this would be an example of one that I would use personally, because the single largest really carbon expenditure in a one-time use I could do would be to fly. So I put in a very simple one into, I believe, flight offsets. And I've just put in a direct flight from Singapore to London. So this doesn't tell me really the methodology of how they do it, unless I dig into, and it's come up with 500 Hong Kong dollars to offset the emissions from a return flight from Singapore to London Heathrow in an economy class. If I wanted to upgrade myself to first class, my offsetting price would also increase by about 4 times, just because of the extra space that I've taken up. So this is at the personal level what they can offer, and then you get a little certificate as well saying that you have done this to make yourself carbon neutral on this flight. This is starting to become compulsory in some markets and with some airlines. So for example, with the 2019 carbon tax in South Africa, all flights internally within South Africa and all flights by South African Airlines had to do this automatically for you and incorporate it into the price. So for example, I was doing some research back then, and on my flight ticket, it did show in terms of how much is tax, how much is the carbon offset, how much does the other sections matter. And now if you go on most booking platforms, it will also give you the option to offset your flight or offset a portion of the emissions from your flight as a optional expenditure. Yeah. So to recap VCMs, many different providers for many different projects. It's open for investment for individuals and corporate, no monetary, no minimum buy, 100% voluntary, very limited integration, and also very different standards, very different methodologies, because it's such an open market. So there's slowly becoming more and more regulation as they try to link it in with the compulsory system still. Yeah. So any questions before we move into Q&A? I mean, the final Q&A. No. Yeah. Okay. So in that case, conclusion, all free voluntary carbon markets, compulsory carbon markets, and carbon taxes all work off the same basic principle, which is to persuade companies and people to have less emissions. They all use price to change behavior. It's just how the price is used, either as a tax or as a marketplace. It incentivizes companies to be more efficient. At the moment, it is still quite open. So it requires more and more regulation and standards to avoid cheating, and also for the integration of other markets, because they are all quite internal at the moment, and you can have extremely large fluctuations in price between markets. In Korea, for example, the average price last year was, I believe, 25 US dollars per ton. In China, it was hovering around 5 to 7 USD. In Europe, it was close to 50 euros. In the UK, it was about 45 pounds. So, very large fluctuations for what is essentially the same product. So if you want to, and then just my contact information, if you want to talk with me further about carbon markets or ESG, as well as partner institution Accelerate, which does a lot of AI and data management education. And then lots and lots of references. So any questions before we wrap up?
Sam, the question is, so in this region, do you see some good carbon projects?
When you say this region, do you mean APAC?
In the APAC, yes, right. Sorry, I'm based in Hong Kong. Yes, so in the APAC, in terms of a voluntary market, do you see some good carbon projects in this region?
I think most of them are quite similar in nature. it really depends on what you're looking for. So there are some that work only on renewables, for example. You have some that work in reforestation as well. So it really depends on what you're looking at. I personally don't think there's too much of a difference between if you go through a system that is based in the EU versus a system that's based in APAC, because it still produces the overall net good. CO2 doesn't respect planetary boundaries. So if you reduce a ton of carbon in Canada, it will have the same net effect on the global environment as reducing a ton in, say, New Zealand. That being said, I do know of some voluntary carbon marketplaces in Hong Kong. My friend, for example, runs one called CarbonBase, C-A-R-B-O-N, Carbon, C-A-R-B-O-N, base, B-A-S-E. If you want to look at that one, they do a lot of voluntary offsets as well, and they're based in Central. Yep. Okay, any other questions?
Sam, what's your view of the outlook of the market? Because, there is sort of a camp would be saying that, if we rely too much on carbon credits, it sort of doesn't help in terms of companies doing real work to reduce their own carbon footprint. This offsetting, it's not a real deal to some extent. So what's your view on, in terms of whether the scale of the growth of the market or the diversity?
Do you want to know my view as a global perspective or for one particular market in general?
I guess both.
Okay. So on a global perspective, I think there needs to be some form of international agreement on the regulation side of how you actually measure things, how you actually set fines and compliance regulations, as well as how many credits you give out for free. So it needs to be very clearly defined at every single level, as well as how the rules will change over time. So that's exactly what the European Union did. They said, we have this overall goal and we will decrease how much you are allowed to produce so that we will meet this goal. And that is very clear. Every company knows what it's going to do. They don't know what the price is but they know the general rules of the marketplace. And that has been very successful in reducing emissions. As you saw, it's one of the primary methods that the EU is using to reduce their emissions by half from their 2005 base. On the other side, if you don't have these policy differences, and again, I'm going to use the example of the Chinese pilot programs. The climate goal for China up until 2030 is not to reduce overall emissions, it's to improve the efficiency of their current operating procedures and their current industry, and as more industry is also added in. So for example, China is expecting to peak emissions in 2030. That means that when they were running the pilot programs from 2015 to 2021, the cap on emissions would actually increase per year. So not as useful. For my belief in what the market will do, I think more and more countries will slowly put in new carbon trading and carbon taxes in the APAC region. You can see on this this slide here. Let's go, for example, to this slide here. So this is 2015, and you can see APAC is pretty bare. But in the last 6 years, can you see we've gotten a full-scale system in Japan now, along with carbon tax. China's joined, and then you have these proposed developments in Pakistan, in Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, as well as a carbon tax that came in. So I think there is quite a lot of developments, and it is an expanding market, which will be quite interesting. Regarding your point on they're not actually doing very much, I think that you can make that argument for the VCM because it can be seen as a little bit greenwashing because you're not reducing your overall emissions from your production, from your usage. But that's why it's so important to have a compulsory market as well, because that one does reduce your actual emissions, especially since the integration with the voluntary market is still in its infancy, which means that the regulation regarding that has been very much on reduce your own emissions before you can buy voluntary credits as a fallback.
Sam, do you have any comment on the blue carbon?
Blue carbon, as in like hydrogen.
As more like I do actually see recently that there is the news a few companies is I guess blue carbon is more kind of using the ocean to sink the carbon.
So I work quite a lot in the oceanic field, but I haven't focused on blue carbon as such. So no, I'm afraid that's not really what I've been researching. So I can't give you a straight answer.
Thank you, don't worry.
Okay.
Sam, can you tell us a little bit more about CarbonX and Accelerate? How do you work with these two organizations?
Yeah, sure. That would be great. So CarbonX is a company that is trying to change how green tech is brought to commercialization. What we do primarily is we link environmental startups that have a product or a service, and we link it with a corporate partner with an ESG goal who feels that the current options on the marketplace do not properly reflect the severity of the climate crisis. And because a lot of these startups have a buildup in inventory, they can provide their service or product to the larger corporation at a discount. So we act as a facilitator on a two-sided marketplace. We also do things such as this. So we do ESG education, both on a B2C basis, such as through partner organizations like this, and also through our own network, and also through, again, trying to find corporate clients who might need more ESG education, and we can make use of the RTTP grant from the Hong Kong government to help subsidize that as well. So that's the primary mechanism. Accelerate is a edtech platform, and because I co-founded CarbonX with the CEO of Accelerate, I've been using his network to help promote our ESG education as well, since he has been Accelerate has now taught over 30,000 people around Hong Kong and throughout Asia, in both in-person and through online learning. So Accelerate currently focuses mostly on the tech side, so that's things such as blockchain technology, AI, data management, UX, UI design, and then through CarbonX, Accelerate is now offering more ESG courses as well through CarbonX, through this partnership.
Hi, Sam. I would love to connect with you offline as actually from Fabrica, the Mills Fabrica. So we are an impact fund and we invest in a lot of startups that are sustainably led and, hoping to provide solutions to tackle climate change. So it'll be great if, we can have a chat, and then I'll see. I would love to know if there's anything we could apply to the startups that we work with, and then the services that you offer. So we'll catch each other. I'll send you a message on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Same here, Sam, and would love to get connected and to see. So I'm part of the Bank of America, the bank, and we're also very much focusing on the sustainable side and to helping in the clients, right, to deliver various solutions. So I love to get connected to see what's the startup you're trying to promote there.
Really enjoyed that. Thank you both of you. I will connect with you via LinkedIn and send you my calendar so we can organize a time to chat. And if the situation improves in Hong Kong, I can also we can also do coffee.
That would be lovely. Great.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Invite you to our office in Chungwon. So lovely to have you. Look forward to that.
Perfect. I'm in Chungwon as well. Benita, is there anything more we should cover?
Oh, I think we are good. Thanks. It's a small group, but I think all of you asked really good questions and interested in the topic. So you're welcome to follow our Encompass website. We are in next week, next Wednesday, we have a talk on AI and environment. And most of our events are free. We want to do this as a community outreach for people to learn more about different SDG topics. Yeah, and we will put the recording of today in the YouTube and also the deck. So because I know Sam shared a lot of information and his references, so you're welcome to check on that later. So thank you, everybody. Have a great Friday. Have a great weekend and take care.
Thanks and stay safe. Thank you.
Stay safe.